Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'd also like to reiterate what my previous panelists said, thanking the Center for this timely and important conference. So this project builds on a previously published article. It's a book project, and my task is to tell you something useful about it in 10 minutes or less. So what I propose to do is situate Tunisia a little bit in the academic literature, talk a little bit about what some other cases might mean for how we interpret it, and I also promised a funny story, so if you don't like what I present, you'll at least have the funny story to take with you. All right, so first, I want to situate this in a debate that happened before the Arab Spring, right? Samuel Huntington, everyone's favorite academic, represents one side of the debate, making this cultural, almost anti-Islam argument. Albert Steppen, among others, are saying there's something political that's not unique to Islam or to Arabs, but something about particular political dynamics that we see in other places where democracy doesn't work. And so part of what I'm doing in this project is doing some comparative cases to weigh in on the Steppen and Robinson side against Huntington and innumerable other authors who have made the anti-Islam argument. I'm going to skip my discussion of Tunisia, except just to mention, I also made a very positive article that came out in 2016. So part of the initial thinking is, why was I wrong about what I wrote? And then looking at some of the comments, right? The questions about, did the revolution accomplish work? Did it accomplish dignity? One of the countries I do fieldwork in is El Salvador, and it was interesting, at the same time there's also a self-coup in El Salvador, and you have a lot of the same comments. So this is going to echo some of the first presentation a little bit, where because of economic problems in the country, because of perceptions of insecurity, there's this idea that a democratic political system is less essential. Right, and so now here's the funny story. I was in a Middle Eastern country talking to a friend, and he said, Sam, I know you believe in democracy. I'm just not so sure. I have all these problems at my mosque. No one likes our imams, and we always argue about the imam. We don't like the imam because his sermons are boring. We don't like the imam because he's not friendly. And so always we're arguing. And whenever the imam leaves, we can't agree on the new one. And I said, well, let me tell you about the Third Baptist Church. And he's like, well, you have 3 Baptist churches. And I said, no. If it's a Third Baptist Church, it's because people in the First Baptist Church didn't like each other and made a Second Baptist Church. And then the people in the Second Baptist Church also had a fight, and you have the Third Baptist Church. And all 3 Baptist churches hate each other and don't talk to each other. And he said, oh, my goodness, you Christians are impossible too. And my point is that democratic failure is often about a shared impossibility, not a culturally distinct impossibility. So that really gets into my argument. My contention is that the democratic failure in Tunisia comes from similar institutional problems in other cases of democratic regression found in other parts of the world. And there's sort of a broader question about how we think about when a democracy is secure and whether the criteria we use are meaningful and lead us to the expectations we ought to have. So I have 2 comparison groups. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. The first looks at a political crisis where there was an attempted coup between 2009 and 2012. In Honduras and Mali, the coups were successful. In Ghana and Mongolia, the coups were not. And then we'll add in Tunisia. I might call them an autogolpe if we're using Spanish, or a self-coup. Similar in that the elected leader then assumes exceptional power himself, or attempts to. In Tunisia and El Salvador, these are successful. In Peru and Senegal, these aren't. In Senegal, in particular, very interesting comparison case, another Muslim country, also in Africa, where there is essentially an attempt at a self-coup that doesn't succeed. A lot of common explanations I find unconvincing because all the countries in this case have inequality and social cleavages. Most of them have high degrees of citizen insecurity. There's the cultural argument we talked about, but also the economic development answer, which is often common, doesn't necessarily explain the results. That you see the circle in red of the countries that democracy was maintained don't necessarily align either with the economic argument. So what I found most convincing is institutional arguments, that institutions in countries where democracy survives in political crises are relatively, I'll use the word relatively, well-functioning, and there's a relatively high commitment. And so if you see, I'll show you two slides. Don't worry so much about all the numbers, too many numbers for 10 minutes. But the circles are showing is if you look at indicators from a whole bunch of sources, liberal sources, conservative sources, libertarian sources, etc., from different countries, using a lot of different ways of trying to measure institutional quality, the countries where democracy failed have less of this than the countries where democracy is maintained in crisis. But Tunisia is an exception. Tunisia seems to have the same measure of institutional quality as the countries where democracy was maintained. And this confused me. Because, of course, if we compare Tunisia to Senegal, right, in both cases there was an attempt of the president to do things that are extra legal. In Senegal's case, the Constitutional Court said, no, actually you're going to have the election soon. And other actors in Senegal compelled the president to do what the court said. Of course, in Tunisia, the court wasn't even sitting because the National Assembly of Parliament hadn't appointed sufficient judges. This is a significant difference, and so my first assessment is that the measure of Tunisia was not necessarily accurate in some of these indices. Second, certainly the case in El Salvador, there's a perception that the actors in democratic politics can't really solve the problems. And this is sort of a similar rhetoric. We've already talked about this between CSID, this is Nayib Bukele. And I think this is a phenomenon that needs to be explored more. Why in some countries under crises are publics convinced that democratic actors can't solve the problems that other countries have very similar problems and are still convinced that democratic politics provide solutions. But then the last thing is, I think, something that's interesting for us to explore. What's the role of external powers and interests? Certainly in the case of Central America, the United States is very interested in stability, in stopping the flow of migrants to the United States, of at least theoretical efforts to stop narcotics trafficking, and all sorts of administrations in the United States have been willing to work with unsavory and anti-democratic leaders who they believe will fulfill some of these strategic goals. And this is something, particularly with the EU's willingness to engage with the current Tunisian regime, something that bears in mind. Senegal has the advantage of, I think, being further from a central strategic location. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip this theoretical argument about democratic consolidation that I wrote when I thought I was speaking for 15 minutes. And I'll just say I think the implications for Tunisia are twofold. One is thinking about better understanding why Tunisia was one of these cases where democracy was unsuccessful when faced with crisis, but also what can we do to reinvigorate Tunisian institutions, and joining my colleague Sahar, as we look to a more positive future, what do we need not just in Tunisia, but in democracies in the Arab and Islamic world more broadly that will help inoculate them from the failures we've discussed. I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to talk at more length about any of the examples or data in the Q&A.